Welcome, everyone. My name is Lisa Moharjan, and I'm a student ambassador at the Center of International Development. And I'm a first-year student in the Masters in Public Administration and International Development program at the Kennedy School. I look forward to today's discussion on inclusive employment for South African youth. The format for today's session is a 20-minute moderated discussion and around 20 to 25 minutes of Q&A in the end. Before we get started, I want to mention a few housekeeping items. During the question and answer session, you can submit questions directly in the chat or by using the hand raise function. And we're also recording today's session, and the video of this event will be available on the CID YouTube channel. We will also add links in the chat, links to the chat to sign up for our newsletter and social media channels to hear more about our research and events at the CID. And our next speaker session is Friday, the December 10th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time with Maria Flavia Harari, the Assistant Professor of Real Estate at the Wharton School of UPenn, who will be discussing the management of slums and urbanization, leveraging spatial data, and that's moderated by Professor Gordon Hansen from HKS. And this is the last speaker series of the semester, and we hope to see you there. Without further ado, I would like to briefly introduce our moderator for today, Ileana Carranza. Ileana is a senior economist at the World Bank Jobs Group, and she's also the adjunct lecturer at the Kennedy School. Her field of work are development and labor economics. Thank you all for being here. Ileana, over to you.
Thank you, Lisa, and welcome everybody. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I am very excited to be moderating today's session. One of the most rewarding aspects of my work is that it gives me an opportunity to connect and collaborate with really amazing organizations and people who are truly committed to innovation in development policy and programs. And South Africa's Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator and our two speakers today are an example of this. It is then my pleasure to introduce you to Sharmi Surianarain, who is a Harvard alumni and the Chief Impact Officer of Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator. Sharmi is a fierce advocate for opportunity and social justice for young people of all backgrounds. And at Harambee, she works closely with government and private sector stakeholders to identify pathways for youth into employment and income generation. We are also joined today by Kate Orkin, who is a faculty member in economics and public policy at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University. Kate's research in behavioral, labor, and development economics is conducted in the context of large-scale field experiments and evaluation of public policy programs. She has consulted to the World Bank, the International Food Policy Research Institute, and UN, and is currently an advisor to the South African presidency on the design of active labor market programs. For the past 6 years, we have been collaborating in the development of evidence-based solutions to of youth employment in South Africa, producing research that is relevant both to academic debates and to policy and program design. So without any further introduction, Sharmi, Kate, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Carranza. Thank you, everyone, for this great opportunity. I'm really delighted to be here with you. I'm going to share my screen just to maybe take you through a little bit of Harambee's approach. And maybe just to give you a little bit of context for those of you that may not know the South African context. As Professor Carranza mentioned, Harambee is based in South Africa, but also has a presence in Rwanda. Some of you may know that South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world. I think the latest quarterly labor force statistics this past week that were released showed that the youth age 15 to 24 have unemployment rates as high as 67%, and between 25 and 35 of over 45%. Over the past few years, we've seen over 2/3 of young people that exit the school systems end up becoming what we call NEETs, not in education, employment, and training. And it's a huge crisis. It's a growing crisis. Some of you know that South Africa's economy has also been experiencing fairly jobless growth. And so this is, this we've been experiencing for several years now. But when Harambee was founded about 10 years ago, the status quo was that millions of young women and men had no line of sight to opportunities. So many of these young women and men that I described would exit the school system with lots of potential and no line of sight to opportunity. Our first 10 years was really premised on the fact that we were trying to solve the demand and supply mismatch. So there would be a lot of high-level vacancies for entry-level jobs. So South Africa, surprisingly at the time, had lots of entry-level vacancies and young people looking for work. So it was a very interesting phenomenon we tried to solve. We were born out of an organization called Yellowwoods, which also had portfolio companies that spanned telemarketing and financial and retail services, and they were struggling to fill entry-level roles. And we decided that this demand-supply mismatch was where we'd focus. And we really zeroed in on a couple of things. One was young people were capable of a lot, but they weren't able to showcase their skills to the labor market, something I think Professor Kate Orkin will address later with some really innovative approaches. And on the flip side, employers were asking for young people to do work, but they weren't able to find them. We found that there were many barriers to this. One is that job descriptions often were not stated to actually describe what job was. So for example, we worked with a hospitality and a retail company called Nando's, which sells a lot of chicken, for example, and they would ask for things like, can we have a packer for our warehouses or a cashier? And as a job requirement, they would ask for good maths marks. And unfortunately, with South Africa's education system being what it was, people weren't graduating with high maths marks. But if we drilled a little bit deeper to say, what specifically does a job entail? So for a packer, for example, it's not high maths marks, it's counting in sixes and dozens. And so that was a skill that we could actually translate back to the young person to say, we need a skill of counting in sixes and dozens. Do you have this skill? And most of the time people were able to actually perform it. So most of the time young people had the potential. They weren't just able to actually showcase the skill to the labor market, and the labor market wasn't advertising the right job description for them to match to. So our first 10 years, this little picture over here, was very much about that, doing so at scale, looking at the right assessments, looking at how to break down barriers for young people to look at opportunities and get a leg up to see and access these opportunities. To date, we've pathwayed over 500,000 young people to work opportunities and created a network of 2.2 million work seekers. But we realized that even that is not enough. We realized that instead of just thinking of what we do individually, because the scale of the problem is really that huge, and COVID certainly has not helped, we realized that we need to work in partnership to address systemic change. So moving away from just what do we do as an organization to what needs to be done at a systemic level is removing these fences, sort of metaphorically speaking, to say we want to remove systemic barriers to create more opportunities for young people. And so now our next decade is premised on this work of systems change. So in addition to scale, it's partnering with the government to seeing how could we address barriers to unemployment at every step of the way. And I'll briefly describe our approach. We really center on 4 big levers for change after a lot of sort of thinking and strategizing. What we're thinking of 3 demand side levers, the formal economy, which despite the fact that it is a significant labor absorption in the labor market in South Africa, will shrink in terms of its relative size, absorbing new market entrants. We look at the informal economy, especially in micro enterprises. South Africa's informal economy is relatively underdeveloped compared to the rest of the continent and relative to its unemployment stats. So this is a thorny problem, and it's something that we're looking forward to addressing. And what we call government stipended program. Many emerging market countries have spent a lot in COVID relief, but specifically public works programs, and we're making that a huge focus of our work to say, how can we get young people into the labor market, perhaps with some of these public works programs as a stepping stone. So these sort of 3, what we're calling demand side levers, and importantly, pathway management, which for us is the critical lever that connects all of these, which is effectively getting young people into the labor market quickly with effective linkages and breaking barriers such that young people can stay in the labor market. This is a little bit of a jargon, and so forgive me, but I'm going to try and break it down. So what do we really mean by pathway management? Over the past 10 years, we've built a multi-channel platform, which operates on a mobile handheld device. So it's a Mobi site, as well as a call center, which has both an inbound and an inbound toll-free hotline, as well as an outbound line that connects young people to jobs. So we have a 200-person call center dedicated to servicing young people. And it's actually also manned by formerly unemployed work seekers, which is quite powerful because they're able to address problems that work seekers have on a daily basis. And this Mobi site, which is a mobile-friendly website, is free of charge to the young person, but also importantly, it's data-free. Over the past decade, we've realized that high data costs are a huge barrier to young people, especially in South Africa. South Africa's data costs were notoriously high, 3 times that of Nigeria and India for one megabyte of data. It's come down a little bit, but especially during COVID, that posed a significant challenge for young people looking for work. So this multi-channel platform has support, resources, and importantly, it has opportunities for youth. So we partner with both employers from the private sector as well as public sector employer partners to aggregate opportunities and put them on our site. And with a decade of experience, we've been able to say, how do you quickly match and recommend opportunities that are best suited for young people? And so an example of this is a partnership which we had with the government, the Department of Basic Education. As I mentioned, a COVID stimulus program last year was looking to pathway about 300,000 school assistants into schools, into 26,000 schools across South Africa in 75 school districts. And it was an important opportunity because a lot of young people were looking for work and didn't have any opportunities. So it was a 4-month opportunity that we were able to partner with and quite inclusively and efficiently pathway these young people to scale. I'm going to maybe pause there and maybe move to our sort of formal economy work. This was sort of the bread and butter of Harambee's work over the past 10 years. We partnered, as I mentioned, with our partners within the holding company like Nando's, Hollard, Telesure, to break down what an entry-level job requirement was and get young people both trained and matched into a job. But we realized quite quickly that it was not enough to pathway young people to jobs that exist. We needed to create new jobs as well and almost encourage and incentivize inclusive job creation. So there was inclusive hiring, which we did with the employers that existed by breaking down barriers, and then importantly, inclusive job creation. And the process by which we did this, and we are continuing to do this, is a sector-based model. So we looked at specifically in this slide, you'll see, we talk about digital and global business services, but I'll talk specifically about our partnership with the global business services industry. Some of you may be familiar with the global business services industry. It's a catch-all term that refers to outsourcing, business process outsourcing, call center work, etc. Traditionally seen as work that's offshore to India and the Philippines, but it's increasingly coming to the African continent as well. And we saw that about 3 to 5 years ago, this was a growing trend, and we tried to capitalize on that in South Africa. How we did that was specifically partnering with the sector body, specifically in South Africa's case, which was the Business Process Outsourcing South Africa. And we convened many people, both private and public, to then establish the business case for building this sector in South Africa. So I'll just maybe highlight a few things in terms of that success here. So as I mentioned, in 2017, we partnered with Vipesa. We saw the promise of the global business services sector. In partnership with the government of South Africa, the Department of Trade and Industry, DTIC, which is referred to here, we helped craft a growth plan to say, this sector is growing. This sector has a lot of promise. There's a roadmap actually to 500,000 jobs in the next few years. But can we mandate and incentivize employers that are bringing either reshoring the jobs or bringing new jobs into the economy to have specifically incentives for inclusive hiring? So hiring of young people and specifically hiring people of previously disadvantaged backgrounds. And so we built that into the partnerships with the Department of Trade and Industry. And I think what was exciting about this was it was a sector solution. So it was not for a single employer. So much as we did have the success with breaking barriers with individual employers like Nando's that I mentioned, this was actually able to create a pool of both jobs as well as skills. And what's exciting is that these jobs actually continue to grow even despite the pandemic. So these numbers that I sort of cite here, for example, is actually quite conservative. We actually created new jobs, over 50,000 of them into the economy, despite even the pandemic. And some of these, and some of these actually grew in the pandemic because many BPO operators were trying to diversify their risk, moves jobs away from Philippines or a single location really, to try and diversify them and bring them into South Africa for business continuity planning. And the exciting part about these new jobs is, many of them are inclusive hires, and most of them, 80% of them, are youth hires. And in this case, inclusive hires are specifically previously disadvantaged individuals who also have a specific socioeconomic background. Obviously, there's macroeconomic indicators that suggest this is a success. So, billions of rand in revenue that's been contributed to the space. But what's exciting in terms of a systems change perspective is that this little model of success is trying to support national skills policy as well. So it's not just individual employers, not just sectors, but can we support this kind of approach, very demand-led, very outcomes-funded, to the national skills policy. So we, for example, prototype a demand-led outcomes-based funding model that hopefully will be adopted, and actually is being adopted by the National Skills Foundation in South Africa, such that all funding from that source is towards more demand-led and more outcomes-based skilling. And maybe just to end on this, we're trying to replicate this success in other sectors that are outlined here, which are hopefully growth sectors as well, such as digital, installation, repair and maintenance, manufacturing, etc. And this is work that we're hoping to do in the years ahead. I mentioned briefly that, South Africa's informal economy is kind of a conundrum in so many ways. And one of the things that we want to do is, despite the fact that we work in the formal economy and have had success there, all of the scenarios that are projected in the next few years suggest that only 20% of new job entrants will be absorbed by the formal sector, and that the formal sector is not positioned to grow as rapidly as it has in the past, and definitely not as rapidly as it needs to to support young labor market entrants. So what do the millions of young work seekers do? South Africa has about 1 million young work seekers entering the labor market every year. We definitely need a better understanding of the informal economy. So our approach here is to support micro enterprises. Unlike many of the other countries on the African continent, there isn't as a robust and informal economy. So ours is a learning journey here, but really to understand why is that the case. I mean, there's spatial inequity, there's structural and regulatory barriers that have persisted because of the legacy of apartheid. But many young people that want to start hustling, which is the word that they use, are usually at the bottom of this ladder, and most of the support for enterprise development and growth is up here. And usually it doesn't reach the young people that it's meant to, and doesn't necessarily incentivize enterprise development. So our goal here is really to understand, how do we get young people to start earning and climbing onto the enterprise ladder to increase their income generation? So I'm happy to sort of address questions on this, but I'm going to move on to the next one, which is public employment programs. I think I mentioned that, in the COVID era especially, there's a huge focus on trying to get the government to actually provide short-term work opportunities for youth. And South Africa also is well known for being a relatively generous welfare state, but there's also a lot of criticism in terms of this is a fiscal sinkhole. Lots of money is being spent on these massive public works programs. What we've done, we have a massive partnership with the presidency as part of the National Presidential Youth Employment Intervention and our work in the platform called SA Youth. We partner with the government to actually match to these public stipended programs at scale. So for example, I think I mentioned earlier, but we've partnered with the Department of Basic Education to provide short-term teaching assistance jobs. We did 320,000 of those last year. We're actually doing about 300,000 of those this year as well. So over 500,000 opportunities created across the country. What's different about this is it's not just any kind of public employment recruitment, because it is coming through the zero-rated SA Youth platform that I mentioned before. There's two specific differences, perhaps that's worth mentioning. One is we were able to actually match these applicants inclusively, efficiently, and at scale, but specifically taking into consideration spatial factors. So in all of our research, we saw transport and spatial inequality was a huge driver of poverty. South Africa's spatial legacy of apartheid is really huge. We saw lots of young people. We're using a term, lots of young people are actually unemployed in what we're calling jobs deserts. There aren't any jobs in that area. But the DBE opportunity forced us to say there's 26,000 schools. These are opportunities, and young people within walking distance of these jobs can be matched to these opportunities for the first time quite inclusively. Previously, a lot of these opportunities could be manipulated by local officials, etc., and there's no transparency in terms of how these matches were done. So that's one sort of big difference. The second piece is that we're actually able to create quite a bit of inclusion and efficiency at scale. So I mentioned the zero-rated site. It's a free site. It's also data-free. It allowed work seekers to save a lot of money in terms of data as well as costs that they would have generated for work seeking. And it put a lot of money in young people's pockets directly because of the virtue of the stimulus program and the stipend. We're just undertaking some pretty significant studies to also examine what is the impact of this stipend program, not just in terms of a young person's income, but how do they spend to generate and improve and stimulate the local economy as well in terms of a fiscal multiplier. So it's pretty exciting that this large-scale public works program, if a little bit more efficiently done, can actually be very inclusive and possibly generate value in the years to come as well. And these are just examples of sort of our system at scale that sort of addresses opportunities and is able to have a significant reach at scale. Maybe I'll just sort of end before handing over to Kate, who's going to talk about a specific intervention that we partnered with Kate and team on, is really our approach to learning. I mean, we're doing quite a bit at different levels, demand side, supply side, also the systemic and breaking barriers. But I think fundamentally, we're very keen to have a very strong impact and learning feedback loop, which is looking at what young people experience as barriers to work seeking. And we've identified transport, we've identified data, childcare being a big one, qualifications and skills signals, which I think Kate will talk about, and look at those and test a bunch of hypotheses to address these in our network, but also with our partners. Framing hypotheses, looking at what other research is saying on this. So for example, our hypothesis is that creating more childcare opportunities in the ECD space can possibly generate job opportunities for young women and men, and potentially unlock labor market potential for young women to re-enter the labor force. So we're testing that hypothesis, for example, now going forward as well, and designing a range of interventions as well to support this. So this is basically our learning and feedback loop as an organization. And I think Kate in particular will talk specifically about the role of interventions that we can design that can potentially be scaled and systematized that could address the barriers, for example, skill certificates. So without further ado, I'm going to actually pause and hand over to Kate, but I can actually click through Kate for you, and I'll mute for now.
Hi everyone, lovely to see you all here, even if it's Friday. So Sharmi, if you can click through. So I'm an academic. I work at the University of Oxford, and we've been collaborating with Eliana, with Sharmi, and with Harambee for a number of years. So I thought this was interesting from the point of view of students kind of going on to put together consortia that needed to do evidence-based policy development. This was an initiative we did with Harambee. So, but it also was a consortium of a number of different partners. And so we've produced a couple of different outputs from this, an academic paper, but then also I'll go on to talk about some of the more policy related outputs that have been produced. So the consortium here, you can see lots of logos. So we had Harambee, who've been doing the work that Sharmi's already discussed, a social enterprise working at big scale with a learning agenda. And then we had a number of other partners. So we had one of the researchers who you'll see there, Neil Rankin, was from a university in South Africa, and he actually worked embedded at Harambee for most of the time that we did the project. We had Eliana as a partner working first when she was at the Gender Innovation Lab, and then the Jobs and Development practice, coming from the perspective of an international institution with a kind of knowledge development mandate. Then I had two research universities, so two academics from Duke and Oxford, the Poverty Action Lab, who many of you will be familiar with, who implement randomized trials specifically. And then as well as some contribution from the World Bank partners, we had a set of funders who had quite a big focus on policy scale up. And so this is put together a consortium that's been able to produce both research and more policy focused and policy maker facing outputs. And so I think it's quite an interesting example because it's a little bit more diverse than many of the consortia that normally do academic projects. So Sharmi, if you can go ahead. So what this paper was trying to focus on was the problem that in many African countries, young people don't have very good signals about their skills. So you can see the picture there is people signaling their skills in the construction labor market in a very basic way. I'm a plumber, I'm a painter, and this is, so vans will drive up there and then they'll pick up people who have the skill sets that they need. But in the occupations where we were working, so more simple sales and service, retail, those sorts of things, it's a little bit more difficult, both for workers and for firms, to know what skills are going to be necessary for particular jobs, and for workers to signal to firms that they have those skills. So what happens in this situation where firms don't have a lot of information about workers is that hiring becomes a lot more risky. And economic models predict that firms will often either lower their wage offers because they're not sure what kind of worker they're getting, or they'll hire less. We also know that where work seekers don't have very good information about their own skills, they end up looking for jobs that they're not very suitable for. And then they can end up taking longer to find a job, they incur higher search costs, or they get a job, but they earn less than they could because they're not a very good fit for it. And so in this situation, what we tried to study was the role of providing more information to both sides of the labor market. So if you can turn over. So we co-developed this intervention with work seekers, who we did piloting, firms, Harambee, and then the research team. So it's a signaling intervention. You can see the certificate on the left there. But basically, at this stage during Harambee's operations, work seekers did standardized skills assessments, and then a small portion of them were placed in jobs with firms. So we worked with the rest of work seekers who did the assessments, but they weren't placed anywhere. And so we tested these different skills. There's some cognitive and some non-cognitive skills. And people usually do very well and very badly on at least one of the skills. So there's sort of something here that everybody's good at. We were trying to capture the diversity of things that work seekers could do. So work seekers then got, they did the assessments, they got some counseling about how they should use the information on the certificate to apply for a job. And then they also got printed reports to give to firms. So you sort of got more information yourself about the skills that you had. And then you also had a pile of certificates looking like that you could provide to firms. And we did a randomized trial, the one bit of which we assigned work seekers either to get this intervention or to be in the control group. And then we followed them up by phone after 3 to 5 months and saw what happened to the different groups. And so here you can see, so the paper is currently R&R at the American Economic Review. You can see the full sort of technical economic paper on our websites if it's of interest. But the basic findings boil down, as always happens with these papers, to a very sort of small set. So we see that giving this intervention has effects on employment. So the control group are the blue people, and then the group who got the certification are the red people. And then those bars tell you if the difference between the two groups is statistically significant. So we see increases in employment. These are mostly through the work seekers who got the intervention getting higher wage employment. They have a higher probability of having a formal contract. They have higher earnings, which comes mainly from being in higher waged jobs. And the intervention has larger effects for more disadvantaged work seekers, so people who had less education or less work experience. Interestingly, it has equal effects for low and high performers and for women and men. We also looked at whether counselling on its own has fewer, but has effects, and we found that it has some, but fewer effects. So it has a very high cost-benefit ratio. So we recouped more than recouped the costs of the intervention just from the earnings gains in the first 3 months after the participants got the intervention. So yeah, we can go on. And then I think finally, after this piece of work, one of the interesting things the consortium has done has been to take these RCT findings and take them into policy in various different ways. And I know that's of interest to people in this room, so I wanted to talk about that a little bit. So the first thing we did was work very closely with Harambee to pilot a simpler version of the intervention that they could start to use in multiple country contexts, and also when they took some of their assessments online. So you can see there the sort of simpler intervention that they piloted and developed in Rwanda, which is another area where they operate. So based on what we were doing, but in a way that it was going to be easier for the staff to implement in different settings. We also did this detailed costing so that it was clear to implementing partners what the intervention would cost. we developed, and this has been quite interesting and worked quite well, a toolkit for practitioners. So we had a staff member working in our group who used to run operations in a country for Give Directly. She's much more operationally oriented. And so she worked with Harambee and with JPAL to develop a description not of the academic sort of effects and relevance of the program, but the nuts and bolts of what was the theory of change, but also how did you do this thing if you were an NGO trying to implement it. So you can see, I'll paste the example in the chat as well, but that's been a really interesting output just for how positive the feedback has been. Because when we go to governments, we present the policy brief and we present that. We don't, once they've got the main graph from the findings, what they really need to know is what this will look like in practice. And that's been a super useful output. And then the final thing we've done in South Africa in collaboration with JPAL and Harambee has been talking to governments about our trial, but then also Eliana and others have been involved in other trials that have had similar insights. So, for example, work on encouraging work seekers to get reference letters that Eliana's done. So we put together a summary of those different findings and worked with various governments to try and include these various evidence-based active labor market programs in government strategy documents. So that one there is the City of Cape Town Economic Growth Strategy. And so the broad idea of doing these interventions was included. And then we've also worked with some different governments actually to start including the sort of intervention in government tenders for new programs. So in Cape Town, for example, the tender that went out for active labor market services had in it that the service provider needed to do this intervention and help work seekers to get reference letters. So that's been one kind of case study or example of how we've done the really direct, getting governments to scale up and work on this intervention. And we've had some interesting examples of this occurring or being at different stages of occurring in other places outside South Africa as well. And then, yeah, you can see, I think Sharmi can round off, but Harambee, that's just one of a number of different partnerships that Harambee is working on in this space to try and kind of bring more evidence-based practices into the labor market space. So yeah, Sharmi, if you want to round off.
Yeah, no, just to conclude to say, yeah, we're trying to partner with many organizations to understand the space and also look at sort of evidence-based innovations that can help scale and address the systemic barriers to unemployment. And so maybe I'll pause just with the last slide just to sort of share our impact to date. 500,000 young people linked to jobs, a network of 2.2 million. We have a focus now on looking at the income that young people have earned and also possibly the impacts on the local economy in terms of fiscal multipliers, but also managing and measuring the interactions that we have. But maybe I'll pause here and stop share to hand back to you, Professor Carranza.
Thank you, Sharmi, and thank you, Kate, for a very rich presentation. And I am looking forward to an engaging discussion. So I would like to invite our participants to submit their questions through the chat and also to ask their questions directly by using the raise hand function. And while the comments arrive, let me open the conversation. So this collaboration, like from my perspective, working World Bank, I believe that this collaboration has been exemplary in many ways, right? It started as a more focused intervention oriented to improve the operations of Harambee and the impact that this has in helping youth to connect with employment opportunities. And over the years, it has grown into a model of collaboration between multilaterals, private, public sector, and academia, to the point that nowadays Harambee sits, in many boards or has membership in many, multi-institutional solution groups that are working around the issues of youth employment. So in your opinion and in your experience, both Sharmi and Kate, what you believe makes this model a successful collaboration model between private, public sector, academia, and international organizations? What has been unique about the way you structured this collaboration?
Maybe I'll leave Kate to answer the sort of academic side of it in particular, but I'll talk about the public-private and social enterprise space. I think Harambee's, DNA was conceived with sort of this public-private compact in mind. Very early on, I mentioned the unemployment challenge is significant in South Africa. So very early on, we were clear that we wanted to work with government because it's a significant partner and spends a lot of money and affects a lot of people. So early on, we were, we partnered with the Jobs Fund, National Treasury, we worked with the Gauteng provincial government, the city of Joburg, and now with the presidency. And I think very early on, we knew that, we couldn't achieve scale or systems change without partnering with the government. And then similarly with employers, I think looking at a very demand-led approach, and even if it was individual employers to begin with, then sector bodies and now multiple sector bodies, we realized that we couldn't go it alone. And I think maybe the factors that contributed to it was possibly the fact that it was a crisis and continues to be a crisis. And it is a sort of like a unifying national goal. We have been very lucky in our government partners and the fact that government has prioritized this, particularly, I think, during the pandemic as a single unifying issue to address. Jobs and unemployment remains one of the top agenda items for the presidency and the country, and similarly, even for the private sector. So I think that has been a rallying point for us to be able to say, this is a window of opportunity. We have the right partners. But I do think we have built credibility by partnering individually and also suggesting that, when we don't necessarily come in with saying, we have the solutions and it's about figuring it out together and co-creation. And it has taken quite a bit of back and forth. And there's a delicate dance, especially working with government. Just, putting a lot of these partnerships in place takes a lot of patience and on both sides. But we're fortunate to work with the right partners, I think, and with many of them. So, but I'll maybe leave Kate to answer the question on the academic side.
Yes, I think probably three different things. I think the first thing was sort of really starting listening to the implementing partners' priorities, and that the study was both something that was important to them, but we weren't evaluating core operations. And I think that can often be quite an existential threat for an organization when they're doing an RCT where if you get negative results, it's going to sort of tank their ability to raise money for what they're doing. So I think that made it a lot less fraught for the first RCT that the organization was doing. And I think having an embedded researcher who was working with Harambee for a lot of the time was really helpful. So Neil's role was really big. And then finally, I think the partnership with the World Bank was very enabling because we were, pretty junior researchers, didn't have the capacity to raise a lot of money, but also, it really, the work with Eliana helped us to do a lot of the institutional things to get the partnership set up to begin with, like the MOUs and those, the data sharing and all of those sorts of structures. So I think it really was a kind of team effort from a bunch of different players, and that has made a real success.
Thank you. So we have a question by Nidhi. Nidhi, would you like to ask your question directly to the speakers? Nidhi? Okay. Well, so she would like to know more about what Sharmi mentioned regarding Harambees' sector-based approach to identify key opportunity sectors in developing the formal economy, and whether you believe that some industries over others are suited or have witnessed more success in producing youth opportunities for such interventions.
Yeah, I'm happy to maybe answer that question. So it's a really great question. So for example, the success that we've had in the global business services sector is great for a couple of reasons. One, we've been able to say these have low barriers to entry for NEET youth, so not in education, employment, and training youth. So the barriers to entry aren't high. So call center and contact center and offshore jobs typically have, you can scale up to these jobs quite quickly, and they don't require a college degree. So it's inherently, the sector itself allows for large scale absorption of the kind of youth that need the opportunities. There is an infrastructure component in terms of IT enablement, et cetera, but that's something that, for example, we work with in partnership with the government. The other sectors that, I think maybe in terms of Kate's work in particular, but like just generally, there is a tendency that, some sectors are a little bit more traditional and difficult to change than others. So I think, those that have heavy qualifications, accreditation requirements. So digital is a little bit more, easy to influence at this stage because the skills landscape in the digital space is quite ambiguous. So lots of digital qualifications, for example, are still being developed. There's an opportunity for micro credentials or new credentials that aren't fully tested to still make it in terms of what qualifies as an accepted credential by employer bodies. Some other sectors are high growth potential, but still quite difficult. So I would say installation, repair, and maintenance is one of those. So for example, there's a lot of qualification and requirements to become a plumber or an artisan. And it's about working quite, specifically with employer partners and industry bodies to address those issues. There's a couple of really great papers that have come out in terms of labor absorption capacity of growth potential sectors, like the paper that the Department of Public, DPRU, it's escaping me the acronym's name, but it was called a paper called The Industries Without Smokestacks. It was published earlier this year by Professor Harun Borat from the UCT to look at specifically those opportunities in sectors for NEET youth and potential absorption for those sectors. So there's some opportunities there. I think tourism, manufacturing, agriculture, etc., in addition to the sectors that I've described.
Thank you, Sharmi. Jessica, would you like to go ahead with your question? Jessica is
yes.
Interested in hearing. Yes, go ahead, please.
Sorry, I am from Rwanda, and I just wanted to ask, what has your work in Rwanda been like? And basically, if you have any success stories, because I know there's a very big informal, economy, and how have you, what have you found, and what do you think will be helpful for Rwanda? Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica, and great to meet you. Our work in Rwanda has been premised on sort of two big areas. One is with the informal economy, and one is with the BPO space as well. Rwanda, as you probably know well, is trying to market itself also as a services economy, and in addition to some of the other spaces, agriculture, and etc., and tourism. But I think tourism took a really big hit during COVID. We did, because of our successes and learnings from the BPO space in South Africa, try to actually push significantly the business process outsourcing space in Rwanda as well. We're really excited to say that that's starting to take off. So we've been able to attract 2 investors into Rwanda that service international BPO clients. And we are in fact trying to do that with more partners. So maybe a roadmap of, up to 1,000 to possibly 5,000 jobs with, varying kinds of degrees of skill level. So back office tech support work, as well as call center work and possibly content moderation, etc. So that's an area of focus. Those jobs are really great jobs, higher paying jobs, and in terms of the kinds of jobs that you would get in comparison to other sectors. But that still does not absorb a vast majority of labor market entrants. So we do focus quite a bit with the micro enterprise and sort of informal economy space. And in that space, we partner extensively with the Ministry of Youth and the government of Rwanda. So we have partnerships with they have really fantastic facilities. Ministry of Youth youth centers have facilities across the country. And what we're trying to do is our learnings from Kigali. We actually have a center in a place called Kimisagara in Kigali. And our learnings from that space in terms of addressing micro enterprise, we're trying to partner and scale up to other rural districts across the country in terms of how do you generate income, how do you sustain a business, and how do you grow those businesses. But that's a work in progress that we're trying to sort of scale up in partnership with the government there. But the government partnership in Rwanda in particular has been hugely helpful for our work.
Yes, Sarah, please go ahead.
I was also wondering with COVID, how you had mentioned kind of one example of job creation was one way that Harambee had shifted during the COVID pandemic. But are there other significant ways that the organization had to shift or move that others could learn from?
I mean, yeah, I think we shifted significantly and accelerated dramatically during COVID. So last year, our plan was in partnership with this Presidential Youth Employment Intervention to partner with 5 prototype job sites across the country to offer back-end support to career services powered by the Department of Employment Labor. It was going to be physical centers powered by our intelligence and support. But obviously, April 1 came, we couldn't do that, and we pivoted entirely to an online model. So all of our services basically had to be stripped away from face-to-face to entirely online through, and then we never had an inbound hotline. We only had outbound call services, and that is a significant shift. Even though we knew how to do call center work, we had to be able to handle high volumes and script for new calls, etc. So we became an inbound call center. We actually, just as an aside, we seconded our call center capacity during the peak of COVID to the Unemployment Insurance Fund for about a month and a half, where we actually were receiving calls on behalf of unemployment insurance and managing those claims. And that was what taught us how to run and develop an inbound call center for unemployed youth in turn. So then we turned that knowledge and made an inbound call center, which is toll free. And now we have a hotline that young people who, either have technical trouble can actually call in to say, I'm looking for work, where do I go? So those were a couple of examples of pivots. We've stepped away from the direct matching and skilling space. Instead of working directly with the young people, skilling them, we partner with skilling providers because we're much more sort of aggregated and scale based right now. So that's also a bit of a pivot. And I would say that was definitely accelerated by COVID. And maybe the last thing is these big public works programs. We didn't ever used to do them before at this scale, but now we're doing them in partnership with government.
Excellent, thank you.
And if I could add a last question before Lisa wraps up this seminar. First, thank you, Sharmi and Kate, again for joining us today. And I was wondering if you may have some last words for the students who are at HKS about, what they may want to learn in order to be more effective at designing and implementing policy solutions and developing partnerships and ambitious system change agendas, such as the one that you have championed. Your final words, please.
Kate, do you want to take this first? I'll go next.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is just being like genuine collaboration and listening. I think that there's a huge academic tendency to assume we own knowledge of what's going to work because we happen to have tested things in a particular way. And so I think, part of it was being fairly junior, part of it was also being from the country where the implementing partner was. But I think we kind of went in to see what they were doing, assuming that Harambee knew more about the space than we did. They actually came up with the idea for the intervention. They came up with one of the key sort of things in the design. So testing the private, the sort of just giving information to work seekers versus giving the certificate. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of that was done in a really collaborative way. And we've learned and continue to learn in a huge amount from their insights in, what's actually going on. And so I've taken that hugely into a lot of my other work. And it's been remarkable how when you just stop yourself speaking and listen, you get gold. So I think that was my biggest learning as an academic from this partnership. And I'm really grateful for it.
Yeah, that's really nice. Like the learning doesn't finish in the classroom, right? Like it's an attitude that you can carry to your professional work as well. Sharmi, your final words.
Thanks, Kate. No, I would share what you said from a different perspective. And for us, it's about collaboration, both with different partners and knowing that we're not single people that could have the solution. So knowing that government has to be at the table, knowing that private sector has to be at the table, and different people contribute different pieces, and putting young people at the center of this. I mean, I mentioned the call center. I mean, every day we realize that, young people are actually best suited to solving their problems. And, yes, they can solve technical issues with the Mobi site, et cetera, but they're also advising a pregnant work seeker as to whether to apply or how to deal with an issue. And those are thorny, complex issues that no sort of, study can necessarily help address. And I think putting young people at the center, working in partnership with others, and also just having a very lean impact iterative approach to say, your solution may be good, but you may have to iterate on it quickly and rapidly test for the new situation. I think those would be 2 or 3 things that have stood us in good stead.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Lisa, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, speakers, for this very enriching discussion. It's inspiring to see the successful collaboration between all these multiple actors, the academia, private, public sector, and international organization on this super pertinent issue in South Africa. There's, I think, so much to learn from the demand-driven outcomes and evidence-based approach that you all are using. And thank you all for all the great work. And to all the students who are joining us, thank you for being here with us. A reminder again that our next and final speaker series of the semester is on Friday, December the 10th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time with Maria Flavia Harari, the Assistant Professor of Real Estate at the Blavatnik School of UPenn, who will discuss the management of slums and urbanization, leveraging spatial data, and it's moderated by HKS Professor Gordon Hansen. We hope you'll join us there. Thanks again, Sharmi, Kate, and Professor Carranza. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.